Welcome to the 8th KESRA Economic Dialogue. My name is Wanjiko Karanja, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar. It's a very exciting topic, and we can't wait to hear what our panelists have to say on the matter. But before we start off, maybe just a few house rules. So we have opened up the chat function. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask the panelists, they can type them out in the chat, and then we shall relay those questions on to the panelists, and they can answer it during the moderation session. With regard to other housekeeping rules, we request that you keep engaged. We like to have a conversation. The dialogue is a conversation, so we would like to have as many questions and comments as possible so that we can at least be able to have your perspective as well as attendees. And it will also prompt the panelists to be able to give us more information. I saw one question in the pre-sent questions that asked what the economic dialogue is. So I think I should start by telling you what the economic dialogue is. So the economic dialogue is a webinar that we hold at the Kenya School of Revenue Administration, which is a thought-provoking leadership discussion on issues that have to do with trade, fiscal policy, economics, tax. So anything that is touching on tax or customs or fiscal policy in Africa and globally. So any upcoming topics we like to discuss so that we can all get a perspective and learn about emerging issues. So that is what the economic dialogue is. So this particular edition is our 8th economic dialogue, and we're really excited to hear what our panelists have to say. So without further ado, I think I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Mugambi Mwirigi, who is the Commissioner KESRA. I'll just tell you a little bit about him before I hand over to him. So he's the Commissioner of the Kenya School of Revenue Administration, like I say, which is a training school of the Kenya Revenue Authority. Prior to joining KRA, he was the founding director of the Mombasa campus of the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, otherwise known as JKUAT. He has previously taught at Kenya Methodist University and also worked at Kenindia Assurance Company. He has conducted consultancy and training tasks for many national and international organizations in more than 6 countries. Dr. Mugambi sits in various boards and committees. He has in the past served as a chairman of the Board Recruitment Committee for the Technical and Vocational Educational and Training Authority, otherwise known as TVETA, which was under the Ministry of Education. He's a member of Rotary International, where he's involved in various philanthropic activities. And he's also a published author. He's published 3 books named Leadership Beyond the Boardroom, Journeying to the Horizon, and Teardrops from My Heart. One book chapter, he's also published 1 book chapter and more than 30 research papers in referred journals. So welcome, Dr. Mugambi, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wanjiko. It is my pleasure to be moderating this economic dialogue once again. This is our 8th economic dialogue, and today we are tackling a very important topic. And the topic for this particular webinar is unlocking public revenue potential in Africa. And we are specifically taking a deep dive into the revenue as a percentage of GDP. So public revenue as a percentage of GDP. This webinar, as Wanjiko has said, is hosted by the Kenya School of Revenue Administration, which is the Kenya Revenue Authority Training School. And in short, we call it KESRA. So KESRA is also the training center, the regional training center for World Customs Organization, in East and Southern Africa, so with a reach of 24 countries. We also host the African Academy for the OECD for tax and financial crimes investigations. And for that, of course, we are training for the whole continent. And we also train various government and non-government entities in various areas, including tax, customs, fiscal policy, and logistics. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon for this particular webinar. We have a host of participants from different countries, from all walks of life, from various organizations such as tax administrations, of course, the academia, from various universities, from policymakers in government, and also from non-governmental organizations, of course, not to forget various audit firms, law firms, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we have a fairly wide range of participants today. Allow me now to give you a quick background as far as what we are discussing today is concerned. So I did mention that our topic today is unlocking public revenue potential in Africa, a deep dive into revenue as a percentage of GDP. And we'll be going deep into some of these terms, especially because we do not expect that everybody who is tuned in here today has a deep understanding, for example, of what GDP is. And let us start right there. So GDP is the measure of the monetary value of all the output generated within the borders of a country. And GDP comprises of various things, goods and services that are produced for sale in the market, and also includes some non-market production as far as other things within the market. But we also have public revenue. And for purposes of our discussion today, we are going to be looking at public revenue as that basket of all revenue that the government generates through taxes, and in some cases, non-tax sources, such as royalties and rates. And we'll be, for example, looking at how governments in the southern part of the continent are generating quite a bit of money through royalties and rates. So, as we all know, public revenue collection is key for effective running of government agenda, including recurrent as well as citizen services, infrastructure, other development initiatives, and settlement of government obligations, whether local or international. A lot of African countries, and indeed many other countries in the world, unfortunately, are grappling with this challenge of adequacy of public revenue. And a lot of governments obviously then end up suffering fiscal deficits. And partly it is because of inability to raise adequate resources internally. And of course, when this happens, then these fiscal deficits have to be financed through various forms of domestic as well as external financing. So unlocking adequate public revenue is therefore an important topic for any country. And so how do countries get to know whether or not they are mobilizing public revenue at the optimum potential? One measure that we use is the tax to GDP ratio. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. And so what do we mean by the tax to GDP ratio? The tax to GDP ratio refers to total tax revenues, including compulsory social security contributions, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, which is the GDP. And if I should just dwell on some statistics right now, in 2021, and of course, the 2022 figures exist for some countries. Other countries have some challenges, and may not have printed out these figures. But in 2021, the unweighted average tax to GDP ratio for a cluster of 33 representative African countries was 15.6%. And that represented a very slight change from 2020. Now, the African average in 2021 was below the averages of Asian and Pacific economies, whose tax to GDP ratio stood at 19.8%. Latin America and the Caribbean had an average of 21.7%, while the OECD posted a high of 34.1%. And according to the OECD, revenue statistics, that is their revenue statistics, tax to GDP ratios among African countries ranged from 5.9% in Equatorial Guinea to 32.5% in Tunisia in 2021. Now, Botswana observed the largest increase in its tax to GDP ratio in that same year, and that was an increase of 2.8%, followed by South Africa at 1.9% and the Democratic Republic of Congo at 1.8%. Conversely, Chad registered the largest decrease in the same year, and that decrease was 4.6%, followed by Seychelles and Equatorial Guinea at 2.6% and 2.5% respectively. Now, of course, it is interesting for us to note that the average among members of the OECD, like I mentioned, is 34.1%, and that is quite high. And one of the questions we're going to be asking ourselves is how then do we get to those figures of that 4.1% or even higher? We will also notice that there may be a country or two in Africa that is, at that particular level as well. But just before I introduce my panelists, I want to give you one or two more facts here. And if we look at the whole of that basket, we notice that there is also non-tax revenue in there. And non-tax revenues were higher in a number of African countries than tax revenues as far as the GDP, tax to GDP ratio is concerned. If we look at a country like Botswana, Equatorial Guinea, Lesotho, and the Republic of Congo, their non-tax revenues were higher than tax. Of course, we'll also be asking ourselves, is there then scope within the non-tax revenue area for our countries in Africa, especially picking from those particular examples? Non-tax revenues actually exceed 10% of the GDP in some 5 countries. And of course, 4 of which, and these are Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia, received most of their non-tax revenues from the SACU, the South African community revenue pool. And this included royalties, rents, dividends, and grants. Lesotho, for example, is receiving quite a bit of money by channeling water to South Africa. So basically from water. And so this is a very interesting conversation. And we are not just going to be looking at taxes, but also looking at what other ways can we get, can we delve in as African countries to be able to increase our revenues. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I have an interesting panel here. We could actually not find better names and better people, better experiences to be able to converse this conversation. And I want to start with Evelyn Mwendo. And so Evelyn Mwendo is a lawyer and a legal researcher, and she's working with the Tax Justice Network Africa. She has an interest in international tax policy, the nexus between tax policy and human rights, and she's currently the policy lead on tax and investment programs at the Tax Justice Network Africa. She has many years of experience in the field, and she's passionate about not just tax, but justice as well, and as far as that relates with tax. She was one of the key authors of the inaugural Fair Tax Monitor reports in Kenya, a report that is used to examine the fairness of tax systems. She is passionate about tax policy, being a key player in several submissions before both the National Treasury and the Parliamentary Committee on Finance, not just in Kenya, but across the region. So, Evelyn, welcome to this webinar. Let me now shift. I want to start with the ladies first. Tomorrow is International Women's Day. So please allow me to start with the ladies first. So I want now to go to Doris Geshoro. Doris Geshoro is a partner, she's she's a partner at Deloitte, specializing in tax transfer pricing and international tax. She has 16 years experience in tax, having worked on several engagements across Africa, including Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Malawi, Zambia, and South Africa. She has been involved in extensive tax research, focusing on the impact of various base erosion and profit shifting actions, specifically by the OECD. And also, she has an interest in the digital service tax area. Prior to joining Deloitte, Doris worked in South Africa as a transfer pricing specialist and as a group tax manager for one of the African multinational companies. And so, Doris, welcome to this particular webinar. I now want to shift to Abuja, Nigeria, and Babatunde Oladapo joins us from Abuja, Nigeria, and he's the Executive Secretary of the West African Tax Administration Forum. So Babatunde is a chartered tax practitioner with over 20 years experience as a tax administrator at the Federal Inland Revenue Service, FIRS, Nigeria. His tax journey has taken him through the fields of office tax, operations, and taxpayers relationship management, among others. So Babatunde was instrumental in the establishment of the corporate communications function of the Nigerian National Tax Authority. He is the pioneer executive secretary of the West African Tax Administration Forum, which brings together all the West African countries under one tax umbrella. And as the executive secretary, of course, he oversees the day-to-day administration of the forum's secretariat's operations. And under his watch, of course, WATAF has grown to become a voice for the region on tax matters. So Babatunde, welcome. And finally, we have our very own Mr. Albert Mwenda. And Mr. Albert Mwenda is the Director General of the Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs Directorate at Kenya's National Treasury. He is responsible for overseeing macro and fiscal policy affairs, intergovernmental fiscal relations, financial and sectoral policy issues, budget issues, and public procurement affairs. Mr. Mwenda has over 20 years of experience in central government and private sector organizations. Mr. Mwenda has been instrumental in the National Treasury, having served in various capacities, including as an advisor and later director of the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Department of the National Treasury of Kenya, which he actually helped to establish. Mr. Mwenda was also involved in the formulation of the Public Finance Management Act, the PFM Act as we know it, and the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act, and of course, the Public Audit Act as well. He worked as a consultant at the World Bank, the United Nations Children's Fund, United Nations Development Program, UNDP, Norwegian People's Aid, State University of New York, Society for International Development, among others. He was at one time a chief executive officer and member of the board of directors of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kenya. He possesses excellent knowledge of public finance and budgeting, as well as fiscal policy. Additionally, he was a development studies lecturer in one of Kenya's universities. holds a master's degree in public and economic policy from the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK, a Master's of Business Administration Finance from the University of Nairobi, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics from the University of Nairobi. He sits on the boards of the Commission on Revenue Allocation and the Competition Authority of Kenya as an alternate to the Principal Secretary of the National Treasury. And I think I'll be starting right there with Mr. Albert Mwenda. And Director General, I think the question that everybody is asking right now is the economy safe? DG?
First of all, thank you, Commissioner, and the KRA School of Revenue Administration for inviting me to participate in this economic dialogue. Indeed, it is a pleasure. Now, I think there is a context to the question that you have asked, and maybe I should briefly just give the context and what may have informed those questions. But start by saying that we are okay, and I think we are making good recovery, just like many other African countries. We have been hit by successive shocks. Remember, even before COVID came, we went through successive droughts, and then COVID came, and COVID hit our fiscal plans significantly. In Kenya, we had, as you know, we had to give up significant revenues just to support businesses. But I'm saying this so that I give the context. So the context is that we are recovering. So in the process of recovery, we have to deal with the debt that we accumulated. We have, as you are aware, we had to retire a significant debt maturity this year. We had a Eurobond. We have successfully, made a successive reappearance in the international markets, raised some money, and paid back part of the Eurobond. And the result is out there. The markets have internalized this, and we've seen the markets correct, whether it is the forex market, and even in terms of optimism within businesses. And in our view, we are on a good trajectory, and the confirmation is our growth numbers. Up to the third quarter, of last year, we grew by 5.9% in Kenya. And we expect a growth overall of 5.6%, and we see recovery in most of the sectors, including agriculture. And given the resilience of some of these sectors, we see us recovering and coming back stronger. Let me pause here, but I could also go on and give a link to revenues. That is the subject of today.
Yes, we'll be coming back to that. And of course, especially on the issue of the Eurobond, I'm sure many Kenyans felt like it was a truck coming right on their path, on the road to crush them. But I think we feel a little easy now that has been kind of sorted out. Of course, Executive Secretary WATAF, Babatunde Oladapo, sitting in Abuja. Are the West African economies safe?
Well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, we will not say, I won't give you an answer, outright answer, but I would rather say most West African countries are actually on the drawing board because the challenges, how they're coming after the COVID-19, and especially the impact of the uprising in parts of Europe, where you have the crisis Russia, Ukraine, escalating down to us, and then with a couple of instability created by insurgency across West Africa. We've had challenging times, but as a sub-region, all hands are on deck to ensure that economics return back to normal, while some are already on the track, some are finding their way. So it's like a middle of the road thing, but I can assure that we are all working together under the regional economic bloc. That's the ECOWAS Economic Community of West African States, to ensure that we face the challenges together as countries and then get back winning ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. Let me turn now to the private sector, and we have Doris Geshoro with us here. Doris comes to us, like I said, from Deloitte. And Doris, what are your numbers telling you? Do you agree with Director General Albert Mwenda from a Deloitte perspective?
Yes, I want to start with a positive note in terms of, yes, we might have several challenges across Africa, but there has been effort, and effort continues to be put in terms of growing the economy, as well as in terms of making sure that we have the right tax to GDP ratio. I'd like to tie to the conversation to the numbers that you shortly gave us, where you talked about the 15.6% being an average for the African countries. Yes, there are challenges in terms of how we can grow the economy, but some of the things that we are seeing from across the African countries from a positive perspective is that most governments are embracing technology. There has been a lot of discussions around digitalization, making sure that we are using e-filing and e-invoicing, and going further even to integrate systems of the taxpayers with the tax revenue systems, so as to really enhance and grow the revenue ratios that we are seeing. Another positive perspective I'm seeing is forums like the Africa Tax Administrators Forum, which plays a very key role when it comes to building capacity across the revenue authorities across Africa, as well as even giving peer learning opportunities for revenue authorities and sharing information as well. So these are some of the positive things that we are seeing. And from a global perspective, there has also been a lot of effort, making sure that Africa is not being left behind. There was a challenge before when you look at what we used to call the race to the bottom, where developing countries and the developed countries were basically competing for investments across the various for the investors. And therefore, there were initiatives where we see developed countries really going even as low as possible on their tax rates in order to really win when it comes to the investors. But there are initiatives like base erosion and profit shifting that are now coming into play to come and embrace and assist in some of this. So yes, I do agree with Babatunde and Albert. There is a lot of effort being done across the African markets. And in as much as we're going to discuss a couple of challenges and look for solutions to these challenges, there are quite a number of things that are also going right. So I'll stop there and then get into the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doris. Let me now turn to Evelyn Mwendo. And Evelyn, you come from Tax Justice Network. And for purposes of this conversation, allow me to designate you as the representative of Mwananchi, because then you don't just look at tax research. I know you are a tax researcher, but you also look at the extent to which tax systems, not just in Kenya but across Africa, are just and fair to the people that we represent. And so, what is your view of where Africa stands right now?
So I'll also, thank you very much, Doctor. So I'll start also on a positive note. One thing about Kenya is that we've actually seen a growth in the tax to GDP ratio over the years. And that speaks to the fact that the efficiency of the Kenyan government in collecting revenue is improving and improving. And as the previous speaker just said, this is because of quite a number of measures that have deliberately been taken by the Revenue Authority, from the digitization of revenue collection to also increased engagement with taxpayers in Kenya. However, as much as the efficiency of tax collection in Kenya has grown, unfortunately, it seems that equity was sacrificed at the altar of efficiency. So unfortunately, the trajectory that Kenya has been taking, and especially in this climate of increased debt servicing, our policies are ending up to be more and more inequitable every year. So we're seeing that in essence, most of the taxes that have been introduced on an annual basis are highly aggressive, leading to a situation where many citizens feel that the tax burden is being shared unfairly, and they've expressed this both publicly, you can see it across media, but also we've seen quite a number of public interest litigation cases growing in Kenya on the basis of the fact that taxes are either discriminatory or they violate the principle of sharing the tax burden unfairly. So I really hope that the conversations that we're going to have today are not only going to be about how we can increase our efficiency within tax systems, but also how we can make sure that it will still be equitable. And at the end of the day, Kenyans will be seeing the value of the taxes that they are paying to the government.
Thank you. And staying with you, Evelyn, I have with me here the tax ratios, the tax to GDP ratios for Africa.
Yes.
And the mean as far as the continent is concerned is 15.6%. But we also have some countries that are at 5.9%. And we have Tunisia, for example, that stands at 32.5%. Kenya is right at the mean with about 15.5%, and the mean being 15.6%. Now, would we then say that all the countries that have GDP, tax to GDP ratios above the mean, moving all the way to Tunisia, are overtaxed?
No. If anything, you have Nordic countries that have tax to GDP ratios of above 32%, if I'm not wrong, around 40%. However, you can't say that in those countries they're sharing the tax burden unfairly. And in such countries, the access to public services that citizens in those countries get is not comparable to Kenya. So for instance, in such countries, you'll get free education all the way until tertiary level. You can get free access to healthcare, good quality healthcare, and they have food security. So in Kenya, unfortunately, and this is what we managed to see from the Fair Tax Monitor report that we did in 2020, is that as much as we actually have a higher tax to GDP ratio than, for instance, our partners within the East African community, unfortunately, that doesn't translate to public services. So an example is the fact that Kenya has never been able to reach and maintain spending at least 15% of its budget on healthcare services on an annual basis. And the result of this is, as is clearly seen, is poor access to healthcare and even strikes from young doctors, as we're seeing right now in Kenya. So I think these are some of the things that really affect the tax morale in Kenya and even encourage more and more citizens to remain within the informal sector where they aren't in the grasp of the revenue authority. So I don't think tax to GDP ratio directly translates to tax equity, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, okay. And I hear you bringing in something else that perhaps we should have a whole webinar on the whole balance between revenue and expenditure, and therefore are African countries having revenue problems or are they having expenditure problems?
Yes.
But we'll come back to that in future. Let me go to the Director General Mwenda. DG, so how exactly, for the sake of those of us who may be watching us and listening to us and not really mainstream economists and they are not in the mainstream policy making space in this country, how does public revenue contribute to a country's GDP exactly? DG?
Thank you for thank you for that question. And it's a good question because it also responds to also some of the issues that have been raised by Evelyn Mwendo. But public revenue has a number of ways it contributes to growth. First is just the raising of revenues, and those revenues determine the extent to which governments can fund priorities or commitments to citizens on the basis of which they were elected. So if your revenues fall short, then you are unable to spend. And if you go for borrowing, because it's the other side of the coin, then it's only just a matter of time, and you start facing other challenges where you create macroeconomic instability. So one way is just investment in the right areas. For example, investing in human capital development, investment in infrastructure. And there is evidence that if these resources are applied effectively and efficiently, then you can trigger growth and put more money to the pockets of Kenyans and have businesses also growing. Now, taxes, actually, all taxes potentially are a disincentive. And I think this is important because when you impose tax, whereas it's to fund government priorities, it also loads on costs to businesses and to citizens. I think the challenge is how do you strike a balance? And then the other issue is also the perception and the reality of whether, and this is the point that Evelyn was raising, citizens and businesses are willing to pay tax, provided governments put good use the resources they raise. Now, the other issue is that it depends on who you are imposing these taxes on. So do they have the capacity to pay? So it is not the same if you are imposing a tax at say 20% on somebody earning 10,000 income, as opposed to somebody or a business earning $1 million shillings a month. So taxes have a way of disincentivizing. So and the problem would be where you have taxes that reduce the incentives to invest in, say, human capital development, like education. Say you tax education. Education, it is important that the majority of your citizens, actually all citizens, are able to access education. So if you tax education, for example, then you disincentivize access to education, and that has implication on the skills pool that you have and the capacity of the country to develop. So in a way, that has proportionate, relatively higher level of disincentives as compared to other sectors. Again, if you have higher taxes on areas that touch on innovation, for example, that discourages innovation. Remember, the reason why you put startups in a zone is so that you can support them in the initial stages, innovate. So if you then tax innovation, then you are curtailing growth. There are areas that we should guard against, and things like social services. Because if you tax, say, for example, health sector, you are likely to get the unintended objective of maybe disease levels rising, and therefore you have a society that is not able to contribute to economic development. So we must strike a balance. Yes, government wants to raise revenue to fund priority government objectives, but you must also have a fair balance to determine where and at what levels do you target specific sectors. So, and then there are certain sectors where incomes generally are low. Informal sector, you have agriculture, you have, and these also carry a significant population. So as you are designing your taxes, it is important to also assess the capacity of these to pay and have taxes that are designed to facilitate growth. Remember, some of these sectors are aimed at providing the basic services. For example, food, basic goods and services like food, health, and education. So progressive countries would guard against imposing heavy taxes on those sectors so that you can support the growth of a healthy human resource. So clearly there are linkages. Tax can be a disincentive, but can also be useful in raising resources to fund your economic development plan. Maybe I could stop here.
But just to follow up on that question on what you've said, DG. Again, I'm looking at the tax to GDP ratio of some of these Southern African countries, and I have in mind Botswana, Namibia, and Eswatini, and their tax to GDP ratios are above the African mean. Namibia is at 19.7 and Eswatini is at 18.7%. But what struck me when I was researching for this conversation is that these countries have more than 10% of their GDP being non-tax revenue. And therefore, the question I wanted to ask you before I move to the next panelist is there scope for our country to be able to draw revenues outside public revenue, which then would go into, kind of ramping up the tax to GDP, the public revenue to GDP ratio, I could put it that way, not just tax to GDP ratio.
Yes, indeed, there are opportunities to raise non-tax revenues. But I think it is important to also draw a distinction between some of the countries you have mentioned. And also to note that in African countries, in the African context, especially the sub-Saharan African, 2 out of 3 countries have their tax to GDP ratio below 15%. Yeah.
Sure.
Then you need to isolate some of them, and actually worse still, some of them have registered a decline. And I think you mentioned, whereas we would expect that taxes should be growing, the tax effort should be growing, some of them have registered a decline. But I think it is important to note what informs this. Some of these countries that have lower tax to GDP ratio are also heavily reliant on the mining sector, the minerals, oil. Even Nigeria is one of them, and I think our colleague Babatunde maybe might speak to that. So they have other sources of revenue that come from, say, minerals and in particular oil. So it is possible, and the one you mentioned, like Lesotho, which can sell natural resources and therefore raise. So countries can use the resources that are available to them. Indeed, next door neighbor to Kenya, Ethiopia, is selling electric power, which is from a natural resource, from their rivers. So you would expect, if you looked at Ethiopia, you might see that they may have a lower tax to GDP ratio, but they can compensate that by generating non-tax revenue that goes also to fund priority government objectives. So it is important to distinguish. Can Kenya do that? Perhaps not, because we may not have the benefit of oil resources, for example. So we rely mainly on our services sector, our manufacturing sector, and agriculture. So there are countries that also have diversified economies. If you look at South Africa also has a fairly high tax to GDP ratio. I think it's above 25%. But if you look at the economy, they are diversified. They have minerals, yes, but they also have other robust sectors like manufacturing and services. So countries have different context, and it is possible, yes, to generate revenue from non-tax sources.
Thank you, DG. Thank you. Let me now move to Babatunde in Abuja. So, Babatunde, what steps are countries in West Africa taking, especially to ramp up their tax to GDP ratio, of course, by increasing their tax revenues? And are those measures working? Maybe you could give us some examples.
Okay, thank you very much. And indeed, that's been a thought-provoking session. So, in terms of steps that West African countries are taking, I will start by saying this is time for a sober reflection, standing before the mirror and asking yourself honest questions. What are we doing as tax administrations and government to ensure that we'll raise enough revenue to fund our development, and not also, like they say in my part of the world, not taxing poverty. And there's another catchphrase that people are throwing around is let the poor breathe, because those were things that came up immediately after COVID-19. The knee-jerk reaction was to start looking at several types of coming up with new taxes, which is like a spontaneous reaction to plug the revenue deficit. But thankfully, that period is thinning out. And now the strategy is taking a look at the tax administrations from Nigeria to Ghana to countries like Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire. There is a new wave of thinking going on and action, and it starts with taking a look at what has gone wrong with us as tax administration, as government, taking a look at the structure of tax administration. And now there is talk about looking at leakages within government, and the issue of tax incentives has come to the fore. Tax incentive previously has been touted as a veritable means of attracting foreign direct investment, and but faced with current reality, countries in West Africa are having a rethink, and there is a wholesale attention being placed on tax incentive. Many of them are being reviewed. And then also the issue of tax expenditure reporting has come to the fore, which heavily alluded to earlier on, which helps citizens to maintain the connection in terms of the tangible evidence of what the tax government is doing with their taxes. So now there is a common effort to institutionalize tax expenditure reporting for all West African countries, where citizens will be able to see on a yearly basis when government gives out incentives, what's the implication of provision of social infrastructure, alongside what the gains are for countries in cases where the incentives are being used. Then also there's also a question of taking a look at the type of taxes we have been collecting. When you analyze it, you find out that the effort has been more on corporate income taxes. Now across West Africa and some other parts of Africa, the shift is moving on to taxes on income. The issue of high net worth individuals are coming to the fore. My video. Okay, so sorry. I was told my video is off.
We can hear you, Babatunde.
Okay, so we're talking about the issue of high net worth individuals. But previously, the effort has been on companies, corporate taxes. What's happening to the high net worth individuals who own properties, who live large, and that's another area of focus for us in West Africa. Let's look at those. That way we'll be able to join the train of progressive taxation, which is one of the canons of taxation, making people, when you have more, you should be able to pay more. And then talking about unexplained wealth too has also come to the fore. And thanks to the work of the OECD, that is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the work on the Global Forum for Exchange of Information, has brought to the fore the need for us to begin to share information that will help us to unravel mysteries around unexplained wealth. So West African countries and the African counterparts are keying into this initiative. They are becoming signatory to that multilateral instrument that will allow them to get information from tax havens and other on their nationals and corporates for tax purposes. And then also the issue of capacity building of tax administration. That's a reality. Like there's a proverb from where I come from. They say there is a certain bird, a mythical bird in Nigeria. They say when that bird, the Ekele bird, has learned to fly without perching, then the hunter has to learn to shoot without perching. Yeah, the issue of brick and mortar businesses has changed. And tax administration, if we don't want to go extinct, we've started looking at ourselves, what are the new skills we need to learn? Bodies like WATAF, in collaboration with ATAV, with the OECD, and other tax organizations, and also inclusive of the likes of the IMF. But we've identified the fact that tax administrations will have to up their game in terms of capacity building. So we are collaborating to look at areas where we need to improve our skills. Areas like data analytics. A lot of data coming in. What do we do with the data? For instance, government agencies collaborate. Government empowers tax administration to access data like data from banks and other sources. What do you do with those data? We are learning to use data in a way that will help us to be able to get where the taxes are, to be able to help us to tax in a way that is effective and efficient. Just like Evelyn mentioned that in KRA is sacrificing efficiency on the altar of equity. So we need data to be able to know who do we tax, who has more money, which kind of economic activity is going on. And then also the issue of the trust between taxpayers and the government. That's where we have a very big deficit. And I want to be fair on our part as government. When we ask ourselves questions, have we been fair to the people we collect taxes from? Those are questions we are asking ourselves in West Africa.
Okay.
Citizens see expenditure on the side of government, the way we run government. They see the lifestyle of political office holder. They see corruption. Those are questions that we are trying to answer. And one of the answers is engaging other players in government. It should be a whole of government approach. At Water, we started engagement with parliamentarians to bring them up to speed with the needs of modern tax administration, but they play significant role in public finance management through their oversight function. And then in terms of how we amend our laws to make it more human and friendly, we're also hoping to get in touch with others who have political power to be able to understand, like they say in Nigeria, the poor must breathe, so that taxation and the way we raise revenue will ensure that businesses can grow. We will not only rely on multinationals who bring in the taxes, but we can also rely on the taxpayers of tomorrow, like the small businesses of today. They can also bring back tax and also make citizens to trust us as government to be able to give their money, because Evelyn was talking about tax morale, and the colleague from, I think, is it Deloitte, or she was also alluding to that. The issue of tax morale, people have to see tangible evidence for what they are paying. And just as Evelyn mentioned, the Nordic countries, earlier in the day, I was attending a meeting when someone from Finland was talking about what has worked well for them. And one of the things the fellow brought up was the issue of they have infrastructure, they have support in terms of security, they have social security in place. It gives people confidence to bring their own money into the pot. But in a situation where you are not sure where, when you are sick, you can't access public health, when you want to travel, the roads are not too good, and you can't afford to fly, people will begin to question. Or instances where businesses will have to spend money to provide electricity, to provide water to run their business. They'll begin to ask questions. Why should we pay taxes? So I think those are questions we are finding answers to, so that collaboratively the government and the citizens in Africa, indeed the potential is there, but it has to be, it's for all of us, not government versus citizen, so that we'll be able to move away from the debt trap that we are gradually sinking into. And before I give the mic back to you, I also want to ask, I keep asking myself, how come these lenders are giving us money in Africa? Those are questions I ask myself, because I think the rule should be ability to pay back those debts. And when you look at the figures, are they actually reflecting the fact that we can pay back those debts? Because taxation, tax revenue is a sure way to ensuring that those debts are paid back. So those are questions we are thinking about. And I hope in the near foreseeable future, we will be seeing an increase in the role that tax administrations and other revenue collecting agencies of government can bring in into a drive to make Africa an economically sustainable and reliant continent in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the opportunity to hear.
Thank you, Baba. There are quite a lot of things there, and there are a lot of issues, of course, that we can bring into future webinars, like that last item that you mentioned on debt, and I think it's one of the topics that we are thinking about. But Doris, you were mentioned by Babatunde. Let me come back to you now, and you've been very heavily involved in tax research, specifically focusing on the impact of various base erosion and profit shifting actions. And we are here discussing the tax to GDP ratio. You have a bird's eye view of the operations of multinationals, not just in Africa, but globally. I think the question then, Doris, I would be asking you, from where you stand, are multinational companies paying their fair share of taxes in Africa?
Thank you, Commissioner. And that's a very good question that you've asked. And one interesting concept that has come to tax is what is fair. And that has continued to be a discussion that continues to, it's like the jury is out there because we've moved away from what was considered previously as what is legally acceptable in terms of what is within the law to the conversation is this the fair tax that a company is paying. So looking across the various issues around base erosion and profit shifting, a lot of effort has been made globally to ensure that multinationals, first of all, are transparent, accountable, and they're basically sharing information. To give an example of transfer pricing, for instance, when I started doing transfer pricing a couple of years back, it was an elephant that you couldn't really understand what exactly is happening in a multinational. But times have changed. Right now, there is requirement, following the base erosion and profit shifting initiatives, there is requirements for multinationals to share information with revenue authorities, and revenue authorities have put in place agreements through the multilateral agreements on exchange of information to receive that information and review it. So there is transparency on what happens on the entities across the various regions. The main question I would have for Africa is, do we have the capacity to review this information? First of all, to access the information, review the information, and use that information to drive compliance in our countries. Because that's one of the challenges that you see. In as much as we have put in place country by country reporting structures across the various countries, the challenge is that we are still asking for the information, but we are still yet to build the level of capacity to review that information. Secondly, for a multinational to pay tax, I know there's a conversation that has come in terms of looking at tax beyond tax correction to really spurring economic growth. And one of the things that you can achieve that is having certainty on the fiscal tax policies that we have. So issues around advanced pricing agreements on transfer pricing and international tax, where multinationals can have discussions with revenue authorities and have a transparent discussion in terms of, this is the transaction that I have, this is all the information that relates to that transaction. If you want to verify that, you can reach out to the counterpart revenue authority in the other country and have a position that basically gives the companies certainty as they continue doing businesses in Africa. So that also continues to be a challenge, because we continue seeing that in as much as we are adopting, for example, advanced pricing rules in our tax regulations, we are not implementing them. And the reason we are not implementing some of them is as a result of capacity, not really being capable to review and have these discussions and sign advanced pricing agreements with multinationals. So these are some of the challenges that you're seeing cutting across when you're looking at in terms of taxation. But touching on some of the aspects that my other panelists have talked about, in the effort of spurring economic growth, we look at examples of issues of incentives, for example. When you look at the tax policies that sometimes we put in place, they are quite short-term. So when an investor is coming into a country, they do not have entire clarity on what exactly the tax registration, the tax regulations in the country are. And even if they do have, they are likely to change within a year or two. So, for example, now there's a move to really reduce tax incentives. But in my view, it's not really reducing tax incentives, but it's asking ourselves, which tax incentives do we need to have in Africa to be able to spur economic growth through taxation? So, for example, if you look across Africa, some of the things that drive economic growth are areas of agriculture. We have manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade sectors. We also have a lot of, it's a resource-rich continent. So there's a lot of sale of commodities. So I think having tax incentives that actually drive these sectors and to be able to support the sectors to grow, because some of these sectors like agriculture and manufacturing can basically grow the economy and create employment, both skilled and unskilled labor, that actually then contributes into tax by being able to have the buying power in the economy. So now going beyond tax correction, as my panelists are saying, and really asking ourselves, is the tax policy or the fiscal policy that we have in a country really spurring the economic growth in that area? So in my view, going beyond removing the incentives and really looking at those incentives critically and being smart in terms of making sure that we are driving economic growth, it would be a critical one. Another challenge that I see cutting across the various African countries is what we call the hard to tax sectors. And one of the hard to tax sectors is the informal sector. Why is the informal sector hard to tax? It's very unstructured, and as a result, it's very difficult for the Revenue Authority to really collect tax in such a sector. Of course, some of it is based on very low earnings, and as a result, there's even no morale for the sector to pay taxes. Now, the same applies to agriculture, because in as much as most of the economies across Africa are driven by agriculture, most of it sits with small-scale farmers. And in such an area, you don't just drive tax. You have to be very aware of the incentives that you need to provide such areas around small-scale sectors to make sure that they're growing. So touching on what Babatude was saying, using technology and really being able to identify who is doing what. If you look at the OECD report, they mentioned that around 40% of the African economies, 40% of their GDP comes from the informal sector. For some countries, it was going as high as 60%. So with this in mind and how difficult the sector it is to tax, you can understand why we'll continue having a challenge in broadening the tax base and continue deepening the taxes to the few companies that we see. And to tie to your question, and that's where now the question on the multinationals comes in, because how much more tax can they contribute? Simply because they're structured and you're able to identify them, you continue deepening and collecting more tax from such entities. Another challenge I see generally across the various African markets is the tax disputes. Most of the time we have lengthy tax disputes that take a very long time to resolve. Why are tax disputes working against the revenue to GDP ratio? Is because if you have sanctity and these issues are resolved within a short time, then you realize that those taxes will be corrected within a shorter time. One thing I've seen some African countries adopting is what they are calling standard audit files, where a revenue authority puts in place a standard file that needs to be submitted to the Revenue Authority on a monthly basis by every entity, which makes it easier to use technology to review the standard report and really come up with conclusions on whether is there a risk around this, do we need to audit it, is there a tax dispute, and how quickly do we resolve the tax disputes. So really focusing a little bit more in terms of enhancing the systems to be for the taxpayers to be able to comply. Going further on, I also see a big challenge when it comes to what everybody is talking about. There's almost a vicious cycle of low tax morale and tax compliance across Africa. And this low tax morale ties to what the panelists are talking about. Tax morale is driven by mainly, and it's very much linked to public service and people feeling that they do not get a benefit for the taxes that they are paying. It's like there is an unwritten agreement between the taxpayers and the state that they would, and it's just built on trust that there is willingness to pay tax as long as we are seeing effective public services. So I think that's an area that we will not be able to resolve from an African perspective until we touch on the issues of expenditure and making sure that we are really getting the taxpayers to see value for the taxes that they are paying in most instances. So the low tax morale can be worked on. One measure is to also maybe have areas of taxes that citizens can see a direct impact, such that it is transparent that this tax is used for this, and they can actually see that happen in the economy, because this is one of the biggest challenges that continue cutting across the various markets. Now, to resolve some of these issues might call for long-term strategies, but the challenge we see across most of the African countries most of the time is that we change tax policies for short term. Unfortunately, That does not work because a report from the OECD shows that tax policies take 2 to 7 years to really be successful and bear fruits. So if you have tax policies that are changing very quickly, and before even we see the impact of the tax policies, we've already moved on to a different policy, then it means that we are not really creating a sustainable tax process where actually we can see the results of the measures that are being put in place. So working on some long-term and probably some short-term measures would be an easy one. For example, capability around the revenue authorities to be able to use information that is now readily available across the various countries. That would be a short-term plan. Building on making sure that we are building trust. Could be short-term, medium to long-term plan because that might take a bit of time. But when it comes to really having very clear tax policies in each country so that investors have certainty before they get into businesses, that could be between a medium-term and long-term plan. So the challenge we see most of the time across the markets is that we are focusing on tax to correct revenue for purposes of all the challenges that sometimes we do have. And then that's where now it beats the purpose. But if we can actually have a strategic approach around tax, I do believe that we can have a sustainable tax process across the various African markets and actually grow tax to GDP ratio in an equitable way. I'll pause there. I know there are quite a number of discussions that we can continue with, but it's a very interesting conversation.
But Doris, just before I leave you, there is a whole conversation that is going on around how much of our GDPs in Africa in terms of percentage are actually taxable. And this, of course, also ties with and I know Evelyn might also want to comment on this. This also ties on the structure of the economy. For example, you'll find that agriculture contributes about 24% to the GDP, but only about 2% to tax revenue. And therefore, is the structure of our economy a problem when it comes to achieving tax to GDP ratio? How much of our GDP is actually taxable?
Yeah, that's a very good.
You don't have the numbers, but from your experience in this area for the last more than 20 years.
Yes, I may not have the actual number on the percentage of our GDP that is taxable, but the main challenge that we have across the African markets is that we have a very low tax base. So if you look at the number of people paying taxes compared to the people who are basically contributing to the GDP, it's a whole different. It's not what I would say a balanced situation. And that's why I talked about the informal sector. If you have almost 60% of your GDP coming from the informal sector, then you need to have very clear, simple systems that you can use to tax that sector without basically not stopping it from growing, because you can see, because based on the structure of our economies, it is clear why we require the informal sector to continue thriving. But having 60% of the informal sector contributing to the GDP and not having very clear tax systems around the informal sector becomes a challenge. You've mentioned agriculture. The biggest challenge we have in agriculture is the small-scale farmers. Sometimes tax becomes a challenge because you're taxing within poverty lines. And that really doesn't grow the economy. So I think beyond tax, we need to look at some of these sectors from a bigger picture perspective in terms of what contribution are they making to food, for example. What contribution are they making to employment? Sometimes tax can be indirect tax, for example. If you have an economy that is driving business and creating employment, and the same people are able to purchase products and they're able to pay VAT from those products, then at the end of the day, you have an indirect way of taxing the benefits that are arising from these economies. But what we are seeing sometimes is a focus on taxation without really understanding the dynamics that sit within those tax setters. What could help with that situation? One is simplifying our tax systems. If you look at some of the tax systems we have across Africa, it takes high cost of compliance. You actually need a tax consultant like myself to come and explain to you what exactly is the tax you're paying and why you have to pay it. And most of these informal sectors and farmers may not have that capability. So also simplifying our tax systems is very critical so that you have a system that actually everyone understands and is able to tax. One of the reports by the OECD actually indicated that if you reduce the number of payments by 10% and the time that it is taking taxpayers to comply by the same percent, then you actually see a reduction in tax evasion by almost 10%. So sometimes the challenge of tax in some of these sectors is as a result of complexity, because tax is one of the areas that is considered to be very complex. It's not your common, what we say, mwananchi conversation. Well, what I do appreciate is that if you look at what most of the revenue authorities are doing, they're investing a lot of time in training and conversations, but it's still not as simple as it looks. So it's really going further to ask ourselves, what more do we need to do to simplify the systems for some of these people to be able to come to the tax base?
Thank you, Doris. Thank you. I mean, there's an amazing conversation. Before I can go to Evelyn, I want to mention that we have over 550 participants already. And at some point, we keep going up to 600 and, hitting those points. So again, those of us who have just come in, I want to welcome all of you to the KESRA Economic Dialogues. We will be opening up for questions shortly. Let me come to you, Evelyn Mwendo, from the Tax Justice Network. I know that you have a strong position that it is possible for us to grow the cake, whether we are talking about the GDP or tax, without alienating the public. And I would want to hear some of those suggestions that you have that would help us to grow the pie without necessarily alienating the public.
I think another important thing that we need to think about when we're talking about tax policy formulation in Kenya is whether it's backed by data and publicly accessible data on that note. So every year when, we're introducing or actually removing certain items from VAT exemptions, it's normally quite a contentious issue. The Parliament and of course the National Treasury get submissions which are quite articulate on how, for instance, the removal or the addition of a particular item into the VAT exemption bracket or zero rating is going to lead to a harmful effect on low-income households. Sometimes it's going to lead to a harmful effect on a particular marginalized group or community and all of that. So I think it's very important, first of all, that this is backed by data, such as, for instance, tax incidence analysis. And since it's the month of women, I really want to encourage the Kenyan government, especially the Revenue Authority, to start releasing gender disaggregated tax data. I think it's time for such a progressive country to begin.
Are you suggesting that women should be taxed less than men?
No. But there should be an impact analysis on how taxes affect more than half of the population of Kenya. And while I don't have hard data, I mean, for instance, when you look at the implicit biases that the Kenyan tax system has on women from the point of view of VAT, especially since I would like to argue that women are the ones who take care of the burden of providing for their family from a food point of view. So I think it's important to carry out such an incidence analysis on an annual basis, or at the very least on a regular basis, so that policy formulation will not receive such pushback from the general public whenever it's introduced. I think the other thing is also the issue of tax expenditure reporting, and I know Babatunde actually alluded to it when he was speaking about it. For years, Kenya has been providing quite a number of tax incentives to various entities and to various sectors of the economy. And it's only recently that we actually started reporting on the amount of revenue that is forgone on an annual basis because of this. And we realized that this is around 2.96% of the GDP that we're losing on an annual basis. Now, my other challenge to the Kenyan government is that now that we have the tax expenditures, especially tax expenditures on incentives, tax incentives which we're providing in order to attract foreign direct investment, can we actually do a cost benefit analysis? Can we carry out an evaluation? Because of a particular incentive, how much have we actually managed to attract in terms of greenfield investments? How many jobs have we been able to provide? Good jobs, not low wage, but good jobs have we managed to provide for Kenyans? And is it time that we remove this, or is it time that we introduce new ones, for instance, for the growth of particular domestic sectors such as agriculture? Like, we need more data in order to come up with better policies. And then lastly, I know we've really spoken about the informal sector, and I know in Kenya, the informal sector is quite significant. But I'd also like to point out that in around 2022, Kenya was pointed out as being the second biggest luxury market, according to the African Wealth Report. And I know particularly in Kenya, this is a risky topic and a really risky area of discussion because of the fact that wealth is very closely linked with politically exposed persons in our country. But it's a question of, if we're talking about increasing both revenue and at the same time making tax policy more equitable, is there more that we need to be doing in terms of taxing wealth in Kenya? If we're being called the second largest luxury market for yachts and cars, is there more that we should be doing in order to tax this particular bracket of the economy? So those are just a couple of things I wanted to say. And then lastly, on the issue of taxation of multinational enterprises. Now, as Tax Justice Network Africa, I have to commend the efforts that the government is making to ensure that multinational enterprises are paying their fair share, particularly with regard to introducing policies as well as laws that are meant to address aggressive tax avoidance. I mean, we've seen Kenya begin the implementation of country-by-country reporting. We've seen Kenya try and enhance its international tax cooperation by getting into the mark, as well as trying to improve its capability with regard to exchange of information for tax purposes. And this is highly, highly commendable. However, I think we face another challenge, particularly in this front, and it's the fact that we've gotten pushback not only from multinational enterprises, but also from the countries where they are particularly resident. And I say this with the inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting in mind. So for instance, if we had public country-by-country reporting, particularly for the resident jurisdictions where most of these multinational enterprises are based, the African governments and generally revenue authorities will not have to expend as much administrative resources in order to access vital tax information that could help us to tax these multinational enterprises better. However, because we are negotiating for many of these things at OECD and G20, which is a group of rich countries, because we are negotiating for these things within their fora, sometimes these good and highly progressive policies and proposals on international taxation get watered down. And we've seen that eventually African countries, and particularly countries within the global south, have gotten tired of being shortchanged in these processes and are now calling for moving the international tax standard setting away from the OECD and to the United Nations. And particularly, we've seen quite a lot of progress in this, in work towards establishing a United Nations Framework Tax Convention that would essentially be the main platform for international tax cooperation. So my final call is to ask Kenya, as much as we're still trying to implement all these standards, particularly the OECD standards, because we're both a member of the Inclusive Framework as well as the Global Forum, I encourage the Kenyan government to continue to still seek other proposals in other more democratic fora, which will be beneficial to us in the sense that it will be easier to simplify the proposals that we get from there, and it will also be easier for compliance, especially for the private sector, when we simplify these proposals with regard to international taxation. So thank you, Doctor. That's all.
Evelyn, again, quite a bit there to unpack. I wish we had a lot more time. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are almost coming to the tail end of this conversation. But I'm looking at the questions from the chats, and I can see quite a number of questions focused on policy. And so I want to come back to you, Director General Albert Mwenda from National Treasury. I will pick two questions from the audience and then combine it with one of the questions that I have here for you. And I can see Ayad Mulama, and he's interested in what we are doing, is wondering what we are doing at the policy front to manage fiscal deficits and debt. And of course, there are a number of other questions on the same. I'm trying to see which ones are not repeated. Of course, there is an interesting one here from Ashok Patel. It's slightly out of what we are discussing today, but it might interest you, DG. What made the US dollar to drop from 165 to 142? You may choose to address that one or not, but you can just mention it. But generally, my question to you, even as you address these questions, DG, is we are now moving towards the next budget, and there are a lot of policy pronouncements that will be made as we move towards June, July. What is the government doing generally in the policy front to make sure that we bake a bigger pie, both in terms of tax but also in terms of GDP?
Let me I think it's and there's a link to the conversation that we are having today. The fiscal deficit and debt and revenue, they are interlinked. But let me first start by saying that in terms of the challenges we have seen, and some of them have been mentioned here, we are dealing with some challenges that require that we rejig the economy. For example, there is mention and that we African countries, including Kenya, they are characterized by presence of low per capita incomes. We also have income basis that the income base that is largely driven by agriculture or hard to tax sectors. These are issues that we continue to reflect on. And by the way, the point you raised, if you look at agriculture, yes, we have, in terms of spending, we have to spend more money in agriculture to unlock production. Yet it is giving us very little. So somebody else must pay. So but there are interlinkages. Fortunately, there are interlinkages within industry. The outputs from agriculture are very useful to the manufacturing sector. They also are useful to some services sectors like tourism sector, because they supply food for that is used in hotel and accommodation. So then we have had a challenge of high levels of tax exemptions that result in high tax expenditures. And the question is, are most of these useful? And I think therein also lies a question that policy has to respond to. So the other broad area is what is the current state of the tax and customs administration framework and systems and procedures, and are there opportunities within customs tax and customs administration that we are not taking advantage of? What could we do? And I think those are some of the areas that that are preoccupying us. There are issues to do with tax compliance, and tax compliance also has a link to how we are embracing modern technology. So in some areas we have seen, if we embrace more modern approaches, then we can unlock without necessarily increasing tax rates. So what then should we do? There is an issue of the difficulty in taxing also emerging digital economy. We, especially talking to the Kenyan context, we have reports that indicate to us that transactions have significantly moved because we embraced use of technology quickly. But I think the tax policy also did not respond as quickly. And we have to now think about how do we then tap into the transactions that are happening in the digital realm. So there are a number of issues that then as government we have done. One, in the context of the national tax policy, we have decided to focus on some of these areas as areas that would help to unlock public revenue potential, while at the same time ensuring that taxes are not unnecessarily disruptive to business, and they are more facilitative to growth of businesses and incomes. So what is one of the areas that then we are focusing on? One is the whole issue of reducing and controlling exemptions. And this has two aspects. One is reviewing the regime of exemptions to identify which ones are useful and we can carry forward, and that would require that there is justification on the value add for most of these. For your information, in the context of Kenya, again, when we began this process in 2019 of reviewing the tax expenditures, we realized that we used to spend in excess of, I think it was about 5% of GDP on tax expenditures. The idea is to reduce this and to release those resources so that they can fund priority programs. So what do we need to do? There is a need to review the legal procedures for granting exemptions so that we have better control. The second one is to review generally the policy linkage and whether we need to retain some of these. And the point there is to then ask ourselves which ones are useful and which ones are not. And it would require that we work with the line ministry so that they provide to us relevant information to estimate the loss in revenue if there is a tax exemption being considered, but also to provide justification. So that's broadly one area of policy reforms that we think, not just for Kenya, I think is relevant for most African economies. The second one is an issue of how do you deal with these hard to tax sectors? And I have in mind here the informal sector. And how do you support innovation? And I have in mind here the young and innovative, citizens who have ideas but have no capital. So one way is to simplify the tax regime, whether you are looking at VAT or income tax. And I think there are options that countries have been considering. For example, when it comes to VAT, some countries have opted, and Kenya is one of them, is to go the way of establishing turnover thresholds. And the importance of this is so that you ensure that domestic VAT is applied to the larger tax-paying enterprises that are capable of meeting the VAT legal and reporting requirements, but have alternative ways of taxing. For example, turnover tax that targets now the smaller and micro enterprises. So this and those rates could be, the rates for say the turnover could be set very low and simplify that so that you have one rate, so that you have no graduated rates, one rate, simple, and make it very easy for them even to comply. Also what and I think this working again with authorities is to introduce withholding tax so that it allows authorities first to be able to then to be able to at least have a minimum tax paid. If you're looking, for example, at income tax, say on rental properties, and this has been a hard to tax area for some reason in Kenya, because of course also of the weaknesses in the records for ownership of assets, and this is consistent with the argument made here that we de-emphasize taxes on flows and have taxes on wealth, because then that helps you to achieve equity. But one way would be to then say, can we have a way of targeting the agents and having a way of withholding tax, say on the rental properties, and some countries have done that. And those are some of the considerations for policy. Other areas that we are considering is also on the tax administration. Tax administration, we need to embrace technology. And I think it's been, it's Doris who mentioned this. The problem we have, especially in the African context, we have also a small fraction of the taxpayers who account for the bulk of the taxes due. So what do we need to do? We need to embrace technology and then be able to map where these are and facilitate and make it easier for these entities to then comply. And again, citing the Kenyan example, an end-to-end system of transaction which allows generation real time of invoices, then helps you to track the transactions and seal loopholes, and makes it with improvement, makes it easier for also these entities to comply. Again, when it comes to audit, it makes sense not to audit, to target the audit and to focus on the big players, even as you expand the base. It is important. Evidence shows that for the interface or the interlinkage between public revenue and growth to translate to better growth, institutions, organizations that are players here are important. So we need efficient institutions, and therefore organizational reforms are very, very critical. Whether it is in terms of rationalizing staff and equipping them with the relevant skills, and also the role of independent authorities and strengthening them so that they can drive the process of revenue collection. Exchange of information, and I think again Doris has elaborated this. I don't have to go into. Exchange of information will help us deal with or address the problem of base erosion and profit shifting, especially in where you have intercompany transactions and where companies have branches across the borders of the country. So it is important also that countries embrace these efforts through the multilateral frameworks that exist. I think there is a lot that on the tax administration, on the tax policy, and most importantly, as we expand the base, we are also thinking, rather than because tax exemptions come in because businesses or citizens are feeling that they are too high. So one way, if you enhance compliance and grow the base, because that's the strategy, by embracing technology and doing some of these, introducing some of these changes, we should be able then to say to what extent can we ease the burden in terms of the rates on the taxes. But unless we have many of the potential taxpayers in the form of businesses, whether it's in the hard to tax informal sector, whether it is in the digital realm, if we are able to get more taxpayers, then we can have a conversation and we can be optimistic about bringing the rates to a level where they are not seen as overly punitive to businesses, and therefore again translates to better compliance. So we see all these as driving us in that direction. Let me stop here, but I'll be happy to clarify if there are any areas that are not clear.
Thank you very much, DG. Ladies and gentlemen, there is only so much that we can do within 1 hour and 45 minutes. And as you know, this is not the end of the KESRA Economic Dialogues. We keep having these conversations at least once every quarter. And we want to increase this frequency as we move along. I now want to come to the tail end of this conversation, and I want to allow each of my panelists to give their final comments. We have received a lot of questions, and unfortunately, it will not be possible for us to go into each of these questions. And as I was asking my questions, I was looking at the chat box, and I was basically trying to blend my questions with the questions that were being asked, but I may have missed a bit of this because of the sheer number of questions that we have. Let me now go to Babatunde in Abuja. Babatunde, as you give your final closing remarks, you may want to also address the question that has been asked by one of one of the participants. And someone tends to think that West African countries have been able to kind of mine information from banks, and which then helps them to improve their taxation of businesses, if I understood it right. And then, of course, you can also give your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Doc. Yeah, the question is actually about the Nigerian Tax Authority, how they are able to access financial information from banks. And the simple answer is the law gives backing to tax administration. So once it's in the law, like in Nigeria, you have it in the Establishment Act of the Federal Revenue Service, that they can request information from principal parties inclusive of a financial institution or taxpayers. So it's the law that gives them the authority, use the law. And I'm sure in Kenya that is likely to be part of the provision in the Establishment Act of the KRA as well. Gives them authority to ask for banking information. And then it's been a good conversation, just some parting shots. Yes. Earlier on, I was doing a man in the mirror approach, tax administration side, but I want to look on the other side. It takes two to tango. What can the citizens do? What can the tax intermediary, like our friend who is on this panel with us, because they are vice taxpayers. We are all involved in this, and our continent is Africa. Africa is where God wants us to be. So we need to be together to rescue Africa from this economic quagmire where we find ourselves. And how can we do it? Tax administration and government need to collaborate with those on the other side. And recently, WATAF was in a West African country to partner with on a conference of tax intermediaries, tax institutes. We collaborate, we share information, we discuss what are the issues, what can we do as partners in progress. So the issue of government against us or we against government, we need to get rid of that and work together to provide the support. And then also one thing we need to talk about, what we see in West Africa is multiplicity of taxes. There are many nuisance taxes, and because we have so many actors collecting taxes. Those are valid observations, and those are issues we need to deal with. So that, as you mentioned, Doc, in baking the cake, we shouldn't have too many cooks who will mess up the cake, and then maybe some of them might be hiding part of the cake inside their trousers or whatever. So we need to be sure that people need to know the taxes they are paying, who collects what, and how does the dividend comes in. And then also the issue of identity management system. I've had several conversations around informal sector, and I keep asking myself, informal sector is not, they are not spirits. A good identity management system, just like what we see in West Africa among the Francophones, they have a card that allows them to move around throughout Francophone West Africa. You can track anybody, and I'm sure in our countries too, we have the identity management system. Once we have a good identity management system, it allows us to access information on the informal sector. And I must say, not to tax them to death, but to also do a form of cooperative compliance so that they can become the taxpayers, the multinational taxpayers of tomorrow that we actually need. So I will want to express my thanks for the opportunity you've given us to contribute our own share of knowledge in West Africa and to also learn, listening to the expertise around the table. We will be willing to be part of this discussion anytime you give us the opportunity. Thank you very much. We appreciate this.
Thank you, Babatunde, for sitting in Abuja. Evelyn, please give us your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to start by saying that I really appreciate initiatives such as the Economic Dialogue, as well as the work that KESRA is doing. I believe that the only way that we're going to improve, I hope you can hear me clearly. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. I believe that the only way that we're going to improve tax policy formulation in Africa and also in Kenya is through evidence-based policy formulation. And I think KESRA and the work that they're doing to train researchers and administrators is going to take us there. It's already taken us there and we'll also get there eventually. The other thing I'd like to say is with regard to administration and how improving administration will also help to improve the tax morale. So for instance, as Babatunde has mentioned, the informal sector is not completely alien to tax administration. What is the experience, particularly at local level and subnational level with tax administration? Do they find themselves fined because of paying license fees late? Do they find themselves even jailed? Like, how do we balance enforcement with justice, especially at subnational level? And what support do we need at subnational level with regard to revenue collection in order to entice taxpayers into the formal sector and also into the tax base? Lastly, I also want to talk about administration. So for instance, with regard to tax incentives governance, there are too many people who have the powers to waive taxes, at least in the Kenyan context. So we need to improve this, and we need to ensure that when it comes to waiver of taxes and generally when it comes to policy formulation, it's backed by economic rationale and it's backed by data and evidence, as opposed to at times politics as well as any other kind of rationale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Today we designated Evelyn as the representative of Mwananchi in this particular conversation, and I think she has done a fantastic job. That was Evelyn from Tax Justice Network. Let's go to Doris. Doris, please give us your closing remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner. So for me, I would like to answer the question maybe on whether increasing taxes basically is going to resolve the issue of GDP tax to GDP ratio. And I don't think that's basically the entire solution that we're trying to achieve here, because by having a tax system that is well balanced, we are going to spur economic growth. We are going to have, of course, increase the tax correction, because we do need to correct tax for the government to be able to provide all the public services that the Africa requires. So broadening the tax base is critical. It's not really increasing the tax, but it's making sure that everybody is paying their fair tax in the process. How do we do this? I think a lot of conversations have been brought about in terms of use of technology, making sure that we have what we call digital identification, especially for the informal and even the formal sector, so that everybody is able to be seen in terms of what they are doing and what is their contribution in terms of the taxes that they are paying. But the best part is that Africa has solutions within themselves to resolve some of these issues. Why do I say that? We have a very young, educated population. And these are the people who will be going to participate by being able to be the data scientists, data analysts, and even participate in really developing the systems that we require to resolve the issues. So what we need to do is focus on policy, have policies that are aimed to achieving the results that we need to achieve, and use the same resources that we have within our markets to build some of these capabilities. My second issue is around the effort around sharing of information across the various revenue authorities, because this is a key game changer for governments in Africa. The kind of information that is available cuts across from the turnover of the companies, the number of employees they have across the various markets. If you look at the country by country reports, it has the nature of businesses that companies perform. It has even the level of taxes that they are paying in other jurisdictions. So one thing that I am sure of is that public transparency is also a key area that companies are focusing on to ensure that they are also playing their part when it comes to corporate social responsibility. So it is tied in terms of the companies want to share the information and the revenue authorities do have access to this information. So the next step is how do we use that information to really develop the economies that we have and to really build a stronger, sustainable tax policy across Africa. Lastly, I want to thank you very much, Commissioner, for inviting me to this conversation. It's by having these collaborative discussions that we are going to unlock the challenges that we have. I do believe that this is one of the steps to many that we need to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris, for those kind words. And finally, Director General Albert Mwenda, your closing remarks, please.
By way of closing, I want to say that governments should work closely with all the players, and therefore within government, of course, the authority, those in the authority that is in the administration, and the treasury that is in the policy formulation must work closely. But more importantly, the taxpayers, and we have opened a space now. There are two things that have happened in this country that had not happened before. One is that we now have clarity on the vision of us as a country in the form of the national tax policy that was approved by cabinet, and recently the parliament has adopted, of course, that policy. It's a basis of also holding governments to account. Related to that, there is a medium-term revenue strategy that provides clarity on what is the intention of government over the medium term on tax policy. And I think we've seen other countries that have also gone this way, and I think it should be embraced. But what is important is that this provides an avenue for engagement with stakeholders. And in my view, this also would help us to address the issue of the uncertainty and the variability of the variance or the what has been said to be unpredictable tax policy regime. And what we are doing is to invite, especially the experts, some of them in this forum, please engage and provide also feedback. Whenever we invite for that, we have opened that space. I think the second issue I see as a key possible contribution by experts outside, even outside government, working closely with the treasuries or the ministries of finance and the revenue authorities, is in terms of data analytics. And data analytics in tax policy and also tax administration, we see as we move into AI, deeper into AI, and deepen use of technology or digital technology in tax area, data analytics will become very important. And this is an area that researchers and institutions that are participating in this area should also participate in terms of collating data and analyzing so that there is tax data to inform policy. So coordination, collaboration is my parting word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is our continent, and no one else will grow Africa other than ourselves. And all indications, if you look at various documents, various researches, it is clear that Africa is the continent of the future. But then, are we ready for that future? Have we put in place mechanisms to be able to grow that future? So this has been the KESRA Economic Dialogue, the 8th edition. We will soon announce the 9th edition. And I want to thank all of you. At some point, we had over 600 participants in this particular webinar, cutting across many countries, across Africa, out of Africa, from different organizations, policymakers, universities, revenue administration, and so on and so forth. My panelists have been Albert Mwenda, Director General Budget, Fiscal and Economic Affairs at Kenya's National Treasury, Evelyn Mwendo, Policy Lead for Tax and Investment Programs at Tax Justice Network, Doris Goshoro, who is a partner at Deloitte, Kenya, and Babatunde Oladapo, who today came to us from Abuja, Nigeria. He is the Executive Secretary of the West African Tax Administration Forum. My name is Mugambi Mwirigi. Thank you very much for joining us. Until next time, back to you, Wanjiko. Thank you.